The room was full, but the air felt thin, like one wrong word could make it crack. Before we dive into this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss stories that reveal the truth behind every family secret. It was supposed to be a simple family gathering. The kind where plates clink softly, elders discuss the weather, and cousins scroll their phones in the corners of the living room. The ceiling fan hummed above us, pushing warm air scented with chai and fried snacks. Laughter had just faded when my stepsister stood up. She didn't raise her voice at first. "I can't stay quiet anymore," she said, folding her arms tightly, as if holding herself together. Everyone looked at her. Then, slowly, all eyes turned to me. My heart skipped, not because I was guilty, but because I already sensed what was coming. "She betrayed this family," my stepsister continued, her voice shaking just enough to sound wounded. "She's been lying to all of you. Taking advantage of our trust." The room went silent. A spoon slipped from someone's hand and hit the floor. No one bent to pick it up. "What are you talking about?" my father asked, confused, his brows pulling together. My stepsister pointed at me. Her finger felt heavier than an accusation. "Ask her. Ask her where the money went. Ask her why things have been missing. She thinks because she's quiet, no one will notice." My mouth opened, but no sound came out. I looked around the room, searching for a familiar face, someone who might laugh and say this was a joke. But there was no laughter. Only staring. Only judgment forming in real time. "That's not true," I finally said, my voice barely steady. "I don't even know what she's talking about." She scoffed. "Of course you'd say that." My stepmother's lips pressed into a thin line. An uncle shifted in his chair. A cousin avoided my eyes. No one asked for proof. No one asked why. The silence grew heavier than shouting ever could. I felt heat rush to my face, not anger, but humiliation. This was happening in my own home, on a rug I had helped clean that morning, under the same roof where I had tried so hard to belong. "I would never betray this family," I said again, louder now. "Never." But disbelief had already taken root. My stepsister sat back down, her job done, while whispers rippled through the room like wind through dry leaves. The gathering didn't end, but something else did. Trust. As I stood there, surrounded by people who suddenly felt like strangers, I realized this moment would divide my life into two parts, before the accusation, and everything that came after. And I didn't yet know how much it was going to cost me. Before that night, before voices were raised and trust was broken, my life moved quietly, almost carefully, like I was always afraid of disturbing something fragile. Our house sat on the edge of the city, where narrow streets slowly turned into open fields. In the mornings, the call to prayer drifted in through half-open windows, mixing with the sound of buses starting their routes and vendors setting up their carts. I woke up early every day, not because anyone asked me to, but because it felt safer to stay useful. I made tea before my father came downstairs. I swept the courtyard while the sky was still pale. When my stepmother entered the kitchen, I stepped aside to give her space, offering a small smile that she sometimes returned, and sometimes didn't. "Don't forget your stepsister's lunch," she would say, checking her phone. "I already packed it," I'd reply softly, placing the lunchbox near the door. Peace, to me, was not silence. It was anticipation, learning everyone's moods before they spoke, adjusting myself so no one else had to. My father rarely noticed these small efforts. He worked long hours and came home tired, believing that a quiet house meant a happy one. Sometimes he'd pat my shoulder and say, "You're the sensible one." I didn't know then how heavy that label would become. My stepsister was different. Where I observed, she reacted. Where I stepped back, she stepped forward. She laughed loudly, argued openly, and carried her emotions like banners. We shared a roof, not a rhythm. Peace, to me, was not silence. It was anticipation, learning everyone's moods before they spoke, adjusting myself so no one else had to. My father rarely noticed these small efforts. He worked long hours and came home tired, believing that a quiet house meant a happy one. Sometimes he'd pat my shoulder and say, "You're the sensible one." I didn't know then how heavy that label would become. My stepsister was different. Where I observed, she reacted. Where I stepped back, she stepped forward. She laughed loudly, argued openly, and carried her emotions like banners. We shared a roof, not a rhythm. At dinner, she would complain about her day while I listened. When arguments sparked between her and our stepmother, I'd smooth things over. "She didn't mean it like that," I'd say quickly. "It's fine," I'd add, even when it wasn't. I thought that was love, absorbing discomfort so others could stay comfortable. In the evenings, I sat by the window with my books, watching the city lights flicker on one by one. I dreamed quietly too, of independence, of being seen without having to prove my worth, but I folded those dreams neatly away. There was no room for them here. What I didn't realize then was how invisible consistency can become. How being reliable can make people stop questioning, stop noticing. And while I was busy keeping the peace, something else was growing in the background: unspoken comparisons, silent resentments, stories being rewritten without my knowledge. The calm I lived in wasn't safety. It was the stillness before the storm. I didn't notice the resentment at first. It didn't arrive loudly or all at once. It came quietly, like dust settling in corners no one thinks to check. My stepsister and I moved through the same house, but our lives were measured differently. When I did something right, it was expected. When she did, it was celebrated. "She's so confident," relatives would say about her at gatherings. "She knows how to speak." When they spoke about me, their voices softened. "She's obedient. Very manageable." Manageable. I didn't know how much that word would cost me. In the afternoons, when the sun leaned low and painted the walls orange, we sometimes shared the courtyard. I'd be folding laundry while she scrolled through her phone, her bangles clinking as she shifted. "You're always trying to look perfect," she said once, without looking up. "I'm just folding clothes," I replied, confused. She laughed, short and sharp. "Exactly." Little comments like that began to appear everywhere, at the dinner table, in passing, always wrapped in jokes so light they could be denied if questioned. If my father praised me for helping around the house, her jaw tightened. If an aunt compared our exam results, she went silent for the rest of the evening. I learned to shrink my successes, to lower my voice, to pretend achievements were accidents. "You don't need to show off," she whispered once as we walked through the narrow street outside our home, evening vendors calling out prices, the smell of roasted corn thick in the air. "I wasn't," I said. But in her eyes, I was. She wanted the space I occupied, not my chores, not my responsibilities, but the quiet approval that followed me like a shadow. She wanted to be the good one and the loud one. And I, unknowingly, stood in the way. Sometimes she watched me from doorways, her expression unreadable. Other times she mirrored me, helping suddenly, smiling carefully, then grew irritated when the praise didn't land where she expected. The competition was never announced. I was never invited to participate. But I was always part of it. At night, I'd hear her pacing in her room while I lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan spin in slow circles. The house felt different then, tense, like a held breath. I told myself it was nothing. That families were complicated. That jealousy was a phase. I didn't understand that resentment, when ignored, doesn't disappear. It waits. And it learns how to speak louder than truth. The accusation didn't end with one sentence. It unfolded, slowly, deliberately, like something she had rehearsed long before opening her mouth. My stepsister stood there, shoulders squared, eyes shining with a kind of practiced hurt. "I didn't want to say this," she began, her voice trembling just enough to sound sincere, "but I can't protect her anymore." She turned toward the family, not toward me. "She's been lying. Manipulating. Taking things that don't belong to her." Each word landed like a slap. A murmur rippled through the room. Someone cleared their throat. Someone else shifted uncomfortably on the sofa. The ceiling fan continued its slow, useless rotation, clicking softly, as if the house itself was nervous. "That's a serious accusation," my uncle said, but he didn't look at her with doubt. He looked at me. "She knows exactly what she did," my stepsister added quickly. "She plays innocent, but she's very clever. She knows how to fool people." I felt my knees weaken. "Please," I said, my voice cracking despite my effort to stay calm. "This isn't true. You're twisting things." She laughed, a small, bitter sound. "See? Always the victim." My stepmother didn't say my name. She didn't ask me to explain. She only sighed and looked away, as if tired of a problem she'd always known would surface. My father rubbed his temples, his silence louder than any accusation. "Why would she lie?" a relative whispered, not quietly enough. That question echoed in my chest. Why would she? The assumption was already there. Accusations come from pain, and pain must come from truth. I tried again. "If there's something missing, we can look for it. I swear." "Enough," someone interrupted. "This is embarrassing." Embarrassing. Not devastating. Not unjust. Just embarrassing, for them. I stood in the middle of the room, exposed. The walls felt closer, the air heavier. Every face around me seemed to blur except hers. She had taken my silence, my patience, my careful distance, and turned it into guilt. No one defended me. Not a single voice rose to say, "This doesn't sound like her." And in that moment, something inside me collapsed. It wasn't just my reputation. It was the belief that being good would be enough. That loyalty earned protection. That truth would automatically be recognized. As the gathering awkwardly continued around me, tea being poured, conversations forced, I realized I had been sentenced without a trial. The humiliation stayed with me long after the room emptied. And worse than the accusation itself was the understanding that this wasn't over. This was only the beginning of how easily I could be erased. After that night, nothing was said openly, but everything was decided. The house changed its tone, the way a place does when it no longer feels safe. Doors closed more softly, conversations stopped when I entered, and my name was spoken only when necessary. The accusation had settled into the walls like dampness, spreading quietly, impossible to ignore. My father stopped meeting my eyes. At breakfast, he sat across from me, reading the newspaper, turning pages too loudly. I waited, hoping for a question, an opening, anything. None came. When I reached for the teapot, his hand paused midair, then withdrew. "Just leave it," he said, not looking up. "Leave it.as if the truth were clutter." My stepmother watched me closely now, the way one watches something fragile or dangerous. She locked her cupboard. She counted money aloud. When something was misplaced, her gaze landed on me before anywhere else. One afternoon, she stood in the kitchen doorway while I washed dishes, the smell of soap and onions mixing in the warm air. "Tell me honestly," she said, folding her arms. "Is there something you're not telling us?" I turned off the tap. My hands were shaking. "I've told you everything." She nodded slowly, as if disappointed. "Then why does it feel like we don't know you anymore?" The question stung more than any accusation. How could I explain that I was still the same, that the only thing that had changed was the story being told about me? I began eating alone. I took longer routes home through the narrow streets of the neighborhood, past chai stalls and open drains, past children playing cricket in dusty lanes. Outside, life continued loudly. Inside, I was shrinking. At night, I lay awake listening to the ceiling fan creak, counting its rotations to calm my breathing. Anger flickered inside me, hot and sharp, but I swallowed it. Anger would only confirm what they already believed. So I stayed quiet. Too quiet. I cleaned more. Helped more. Tried to prove something. No one had asked to be proven. Each effort fell into the same void. What hurt the most wasn't being doubted. It was being abandoned emotionally by the people who were supposed to protect me, without asking a single hard question. I had been judged without evidence, without defense, without a chance to stand whole in my own truth. And slowly, painfully, I began to understand something darker. In this house, silence wasn't neutral. It was a verdict. And it was pushing me toward a breaking point I could no longer ignore. There is a kind of silence that feels like surrender, and another that feels like survival. I chose the second one, even though no one understood the difference. I stopped explaining myself. Not because I had nothing to say, but because every word I offered seemed to disappear into the same empty space where trust used to live. My truth sounded small in a house that had already decided its version of events. So I folded my voice inward and carried it quietly, the way one carries something fragile through a crowd. Days passed like that. Heavy. Measured. I moved through the house carefully, aware of every creaking floorboard, every pause in conversation when I entered a room. When my stepmother asked questions, I answered briefly. When my father remained silent, I respected it. Silence, I told myself, would protect me from saying the wrong thing. In the early mornings, I walked to the corner shop alone. The city was softer then, streets half awake, stray cats stretching in the dust, the smell of fresh bread drifting from nearby ovens. I breathed deeply, pretending that outside these walls, I was still whole. At home, my quiet was misunderstood. "She has nothing to say," I overheard once. "That's how guilty people behave," someone whispered another time. Each sentence cut deeper than shouting ever could. At night, I sat by my window, watching lights flicker across rooftops, listening to distant traffic and the occasional bark of a dog. I replayed conversations in my head, the moments where I could have raised my voice, demanded proof, forced them to listen, but I didn't. Because somewhere deep inside, I believed the truth had its own timing. That lies, no matter how competently spoken, eventually collapsed under their own weight. Still, doubt crept in during the quietest hours. What if my silence didn't look like strength? What if it only made me easier to blame? I pressed my palms together, grounding myself. I reminded myself who I was before the accusation. The girl who woke early. The one who kept peace. The one who didn't take what wasn't hers. I held on to that version of myself tightly. But silence has a cost. It isolates. It invites assumptions. And in a house already leaning toward judgment, my restraint began to look like admission. I didn't yet know that while I was choosing silence to protect the truth, someone else was struggling to keep their story straight. Small cracks were forming. I couldn't see them yet, but they were there. And soon, the quiet I had chosen would force everything hidden into the open. The first crack appeared quietly, so small that almost no one noticed it. It was a late afternoon, the kind where the sky hangs low and dusty, and the electricity flickers without warning. My stepsister sat in the living room, scrolling through her phone while my aunt sipped tea nearby. The television murmured in the background, but no one was really watching. "You said she took the money last Friday, right?" my aunt asked casually, stirring her cup. "Yes," my stepsister replied without looking up. "After dinner." My aunt paused. "That's strange. I remember you calling me that evening. You were upset because you couldn't find your purse then." My stepsister's fingers stopped moving. "Well, yes. That was later," she said quickly. "I found it after." My aunt nodded, but her eyes lingered a moment too long. Later that night, another detail surfaced. My cousin mentioned a message, one my stepsister claimed I had sent, asking for access to a cupboard. "I don't remember seeing that," he said, frowning. "You usually keep screenshots of everything." "I deleted it," she snapped. "Why would I keep something like that?" The room went quiet. Deleted messages, misplaced times, shifting explanations, nothing big enough to cause a confrontation, but enough to unsettle the certainty that had settled so comfortably before. Even my father began to notice. One evening, while the call to prayer echoed through the neighborhood, he stood near the doorway, listening as my stepsister explained the story again, to a neighbor this time. The lock was already broken, she said now. My father's brows furrowed. He remembered her saying it had been forced. He said nothing. But his silence was different now. My stepmother, too, started double-checking details. She counted money again and again, yet nothing was missing. She searched drawers that were supposedly disturbed, everything neatly in place. Meanwhile, my stepsister grew restless. Her laughter sounded sharper. Her patience thinner. When questioned gently, she responded defensively. "Why is everyone suddenly doubting me?" she demanded one night. "I'm the one who was wronged." No one answered immediately. Because doubt had entered the room, and doubt doesn't announce itself. It sits quietly, comparing stories, replaying conversations, noticing what doesn't align. Whispers returned, but this time they weren't about me. They were about her. The story that had once sounded solid now felt unstable, like a wall with hidden fractures. And every time my stepsister repeated it, the cracks spread wider. The truth hadn't arrived yet. But it was pressing from beneath the surface, waiting for the moment it could no longer be contained. The truth didn't arrive dramatically. It didn't shout or demand attention. It surfaced the way it always does, quietly, undeniably. It was evening again, the house lit by yellow bulbs that cast long shadows across the walls. The family had gathered without ceremony, tension pulling everyone into the same room. No one said why we were there, but everyone felt it. Even the air seemed to wait. My father stood near the table, holding a phone in his hand. His grip was tight, knuckles pale. "Explain this," he said, his voice low. My stepsister froze. On the screen was a message, timestamped, saved automatically to the cloud. A voice note she had forgotten about. In it, her own voice, hurried and sharp, whispered instructions to a friend about moving money before anyone noticed. About blaming me if questions were asked. The room seemed to tilt. "That's not," she began, stepping forward. "You don't understand." My stepmother took the phone from my father, her fingers trembling as she listened again. Her face drained of color. "You said she did it," she whispered. "You swore." One by one, the pieces fell into place. The missing timeline, the deleted messages that were suddenly retrievable. The neighbor who confirmed my stepsister had been alone in the house that afternoon. The locked cupboard that had never been forced at all. My stepsister's confidence cracked. Her shoulders sagged. Her words tangled. Her voice broke. I was tired of always being second. Everyone trusted her. Everyone believed her. I wanted that too. Silence swallowed the room. Not the sharp, accusing silence from before, but a heavy, regretful one. I stood there, feeling something loosen in my chest. Not triumph. Not anger. Just release. Like I had been holding my breath for weeks without realizing it. My father turned to me slowly. His eyes were wet. "Why didn't you say something?" he asked. "I did," I replied softly. "You just didn't hear me." That was when the weight of it all finally landed. My stepsister sank onto the sofa, covering her face. No one rushed to comfort her this time. The truth had redrawn the room, shifted loyalties, exposed how easily I had been sacrificed to keep peace. Outside, a breeze rattled the window panes. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughed. Life, indifferent and steady, moved on. Apologies followed, quiet, awkward, incomplete. But something had already changed inside me. The truth had come out. And now, I had to decide what to do with it. Apologies came in fragments. Some arrived late at night, whispered through half-open doors. Others were folded into awkward silences, into cups of tea placed gently beside me and left untouched. My father tried to explain himself once, his voice heavy with regret. My stepmother avoided my eyes, her kindness sudden and unfamiliar. They meant well, but meaning well did not undo what had already been done. I listened. I nodded. And then I let them go. Not because I was cruel, but because I was tired. One morning, before the house woke, I stepped outside. The sky was pale, just beginning to warm, birds arguing softly from the electric wires. The street smelled of dust and fresh bread from the tandoor down the lane. Life was starting again, indifferent to my pain, and that felt strangely comforting. I walked without urgency, my footsteps light for the first time in weeks. With every step, I felt something loosen, the need to be believed, the need to be chosen, the need to be forgiven for something I never did. For years, I had tried to earn my place by being useful, quiet, agreeable. I thought dignity came from endurance. I was wrong. Dignity came from leaving what kept asking me to shrink. At the edge of the neighborhood, where the city thinned into open fields, I stopped. The wind moved freely there, brushing against tall grass, carrying the distant sound of traffic and prayer. I closed my eyes and breathed, not shallow breaths shaped by fear, but full ones. No one followed me. And for the first time, that didn't hurt. I choose myself, I whispered, not as a declaration to anyone else, but as a promise I intended to keep. When I returned, I didn't announce my decision. I didn't argue or explain. I packed quietly. Folded my clothes. Left behind the version of me that waited for approval. At the doorway, I paused once, listening to the familiar sounds of the house. They no longer felt like home. That was okay. I stepped out with nothing dramatic, no slammed doors, no final speeches. Just clarity. The truth had freed my name. But walking away freed my soul. And as the city opened up around me, full of noise, possibility, and unfinished roads, I understood something simple and powerful. I didn't lose a family. I found myself.